Questions nobody asks. With a John Michael Swifter. What, was that bad?
So I reached the $100 goal on my Patreon campaign. Thank you, Buck, Zach, and Sean. You're so great, I put your name in a song. We hit the mark, now I'm up to the task. I'm making a show about the questions you ask. So I've been taking a much more entrepreneurial view of my creative projects over the past year, and kind of in that spirit, I want to explore a theme in this basic Q&A show, which is customer uncertainty. We're kind of aiming for a Wednesday release with this, but one thing I'm going to definitely try to focus on is this idea that people aren't always sure what they need or what they want to know, or there's sometimes a background sort of elephant in the room that never gets discussed. So in addition to answering real questions I get in comments or in emails, or that just come up in the course of my lessons or what have you, I'm also going to talk about an unspoken question every time, or just something that I feel like is interesting, or maybe it's like a question I wish people asked, or like I said, I'm really into this elephant in the room idea. And the last thing I'd like to say is that I'm going to take questions from all over the place, anywhere I can get them that I think is interesting, but I'm going to try to give priority to folks who are supporting me on the Patreon campaign, because really that's how I kind of fund the time. So if you guys are interested in what we have to say here, think about jumping on the Patreon campaign. It really helps me do this. Yeah, with that, let's get into the questions for this week. The first question is from Opikun DPS. He says, "Hi. I wanted to ask a question which probably nobody ever asked. Everyone wants to focus on playing solos. They focus on scales, etc., but how to create different accompaniment for different musical genres, how to compose and arrange different musical styles. This is a question I am so glad he asked, because this really gets into the stuff I really like to do on this channel, which is what I call musical gene splicing. I tend to think about different cultures having what I call just cultural infrastructure. If you look at different styles of music, you see that there are certain ideas that a certain style will have developed really well. Like if you compare Western classical music with Indian classical music, counterpoint is an idea that's really well developed in Europe, but melody is not very well developed at all. Like the understanding of melodic theory is very weak, in my opinion, in Europe. If you go to India, raga theory, it takes melodic theory just to such an incredibly deep degree. Often what I'll do is I'll try to look at different styles of music and figure out, okay, what is some idea that this style has that is really well developed, and how can I apply that to other things? It's kind of like, you kind of like a shut up and play kind of person, or are you a really kind of head brainiac theory type of person? Now, the noted music theorist William Alauddin Matthew made a really good point that nobody is really totally one or the other of these extremes. Everyone has at least a little bit of theory or a little bit of practical. Some are way to the far extremes, but I find that if you use sort of a synthesized approach of both, you get really great tools to help you get a lot further, a lot faster. So let me just take an example that I've done on this channel that you might recognize, the Blues Raga series. I had a really hard time understanding how the blues went, so I started taking raga theory, but I was also listening to like Eric Clapton and Stevie Ray Vaughan and Robert Johnson, and I was looking for the core phrases that were described in raga music, these 2 to 4 note like gene phrases, and I actually found them fairly easily, and I was using these systematized exercises, and I really liked the results I got in my playing. I felt like I got a very natural sound out of it that's very flexible, but I also understand it on a very deep level, and I can develop it in terms of structured improvisation. I found that approach really effective. So if we go back to Opikun's original question, we have, a style of like accompaniment. You want to look at accompaniment patterns. One style I can think of where the accompaniment patterns are really well described is banjo rolls. If you talk to 3-finger banjo players, they think about the types of rolls they do all the time. And there is a lot of thought of that going on in Travis picking too, but it's less specific. But what I might do is go into those styles and figure out, okay, how do the players who really do this stuff describe it? Can we borrow some ideas about the mnemonics? And if you can't, I say make up new stuff, figure out goofy stuff. Like, can you make like a peg word system? Can you find like some association with a famous song? Or you can even do a mathematical and call it the 1-3-2 pattern or whatever. You can contribute your own ideas to this stuff. You can come up with your own system. That's generally what I would say, is looking at other styles of music and figure out who has a really good way of describing the thing you're talking about. You can apply that to a lot of different styles and then kind of genre hop a little bit more. But having techniques to really get better at individual styles, that really helps a lot. Great example of this in history is Guido of Arezzo. Guido of Arezzo was a Catholic monk. I think he's around the 9th century. He's kind of right around the turn of the first millennium. He was one of the really famous systematizers of Gregorian chant. He's basically credited with inventing solfege. He had a way of showing you like the notes in a scale on your hand. Before the system, there wasn't even chicken scratch to notate the Gregorian chant. So trying to remember them was really hard. People have a really hard time remembering stuff they can't represent some way. These actually help you remember things way, way faster and learn faster, so you can absorb more stuff and play more music more easily. So it's a really good question. It's a thing I really like to explore. KP, the Brazilian from America, has asked me the question, what are those things on your fingers? Now I'm going to put the picks on. You can probably cut all this garbage. Yeah, you knew it was coming. These, my friends, are Alaska picks. And I'm glad I finally got to answer this, because this is by far the #1 question I've had over the whole life of this channel. You know, doing the Pluck and Chuck series, everyone always sees these things on my fingers. They're like, what are they? Well, as far as I know, these are made by a guy working basically out of a wood shop in Washington State. But, I mean, I'm all about the indie businesses. But these things have really solved a lot of problems for me. I come from a classical guitar background where you learn to kind of shape the nail in a way that it sort of rides upon both the nail and the flesh, gives you a really nice balanced tone. When you start playing steel guitar, I started going away from nylons more towards steel when I got out of college. And these suckers, your regular nails can't stand up against steel. It's just like, you know, it's like sticks versus bricks. It's like, it's no competition. These things, they last about 100 times longer than my normal nails. They keep their shape. When you're professional and you just have to have more consistency, it's way better to just do this than go with the natural nails. I've tried all kinds of stuff. I tried nail strengthener, polisher. Almost everything helps a bit. This is my favorite system so far. They take a little bit of time to adapt to. And the one thing I will say is that if I try to go to funk bass technique, like if I try to play these with my bass, it's really problematic, but everything I do on the guitar normally, all my Travis picking, all my pluck and chuck, all my regular fingerstyle stuff, and I can even switch into using the thumb pick for like blues raking and just like regular lead guitar solos. It works really well. It definitely takes a while to adapt your right hand technique to getting used to using them, but my system right now where I use a thumb pick and then 4 Alaska picks, it's unbelievably flexible and it's very consistent, and I gotta say, it's really hard to beat. I really should do like a whole video just on this because I could really get into it. Short answer is Alaska picks. Long answer is, you know, the John Michael Swift 5-finger system. Let's call it that, what have you. Luke Riley and Henry Campbell, and actually a bunch of others recently, have been asking, in so many words, when are the advanced lessons coming out, or the part 3 lessons coming out? And that's a really interesting question. I feel like all the creative juice in my channel is there, but it's also a ton of work too. The plan kind of went that I conceived the Songwriters Grooves project, and I thought of all these ideas for advanced lessons, and then I started making them. And then I either, you know, learned all the technique and then forgot it before I filmed it, or I just never quite got there with stuff. I've been a little bit lazy about that. But I also kind of hit a point where I thought to myself, man, no one's really going to care about this stuff, so I think I'm kind of going to just leave it behind. But recently there's been just like, I've noticed a lot more people asking, well, where are the advanced lessons? And I've started to think to myself, maybe there's more interest in this than I originally thought. That being said, it's actually, as interested as I am in that, it's actually not the top thing on my creative chopping block. I'm actually working on a couple of documentaries this year. It's just trying to squeeze it in versus all the other stuff I have to do, plus the other work I kind of have to do to survive. It's just like, it's a creative competition type of thing, and I kind of have to choose my battles. There's kind of 1 or 2 ways I see them coming out. Possibly if I can use some of the things like the Patreon campaign to support my work a little bit more, so I can kind of drop some of my other projects and afford to do that, I'll probably have more time for advanced lessons. But the other way I'm thinking of trying to do it is I'm actually might be trying to squeeze some of those projects in with one of the documentaries I'm working on. If I can find a way to work those 2 things together, we might be able to get a 2-for-1, but it really depends. You know, it's an interesting question, and it's something I'm really, really curious about, because it's like, you know, all these fun songs like Treetop Flyer and 1952 Vincent Black Lightning, like the creative potential for fingerstyle exploration on songs like that, or all the John Mayer stuff, like the things that are suggested are so juicy. And I have all these ideas that are just sitting there. I just gotta sit down and make them. Hopefully this year, I don't really know yet. I'm still trying to work it out. You'll know when I got it worked out. Psh. So in one of my lessons with one of my students this week, Max Frem Schwartz, he had a problem with his thumb. He had his thumb really hurt, and he asked me, okay, John, what do you do when one of your fingers gets injured? That's a really good question. The simple answer is you adapt. That's what you do. This happens all the time when you get some kind of performance injury and you got to figure, okay, how do you kind of get around it? I mean, a lot of people just tend to put down their guitar. They say, oh, my hand's hurt, I'm not going to play today. I mean, you got to watch out for those tapes in your head that try to make all the excuses for why to not play. Problems you run into, they are opportunities. You got to take a bull by the horns and figure out a way around it. in essence, the answer that I would say a little more specifically is what I call redigitization. Some of the fingers that you need for a certain technique aren't working. You find another technique or another implement that gets around it. So let's like look at the specific example there. Max was saying he had like a blister on his thumb. And I've had this before. I switched over to bass, and you know, even the surfaces on the fingers that I was playing the bass with didn't really get much exercise before I got blisters right away. And I was like, what am I going to do? And I started switching through the other fingers, and then they all got blisters too. You know, so you start to figure out like, what the heck are you going to do? If you can have other right hand techniques that will let you explore the things you're working on, especially in the entry phase of starting a new instrument, you can practice a lot more and not get slowed down. Or if you get a performance injury while you're working on something advanced, you can actually find new approaches to work on stuff that take you deeper into challenging stuff. So a specific example with the strumming. You know, let's say you're used to strumming with your thumb, and your thumb's got an injury. You know, well, the first thing I said is, well, you got a pick. Max doesn't have a pick. Okay, fine. You ever try like just taking your two fingers and put them together and making them a pick like that? You're kind of like using the downstroke there to make a pick with your thumb and with your pointer finger, and then up with the thumb. You can strum like that. You can strum the Hawaiian way, which is you take your pointer finger, kind of use the pad there. I'm just kind of taking that pointer finger going. It's a very mellow sound. You can also do the Spanish technique, which they call punteado, where you kind of plant the thumb right here, and it's just the pointer finger kind of going up and down like this. Kind of goes with that rasgueado too. Not terribly great at that technique, but you can see there's a ton of ways to strum that aren't whatever technique you normally use, and if one of your fingers goes down, you don't have to be stuck. I had an example from a jam the other night. I went out to an Irish jam with my girlfriend, and I was just trying to finger pick along because I didn't really know the songs. My middle finger pick was starting to fall off and kind of doing like a little reverse bird there. The thing I realized was that since I didn't have tape to keep my finger pick on, I had to find a way to use these other fingers to get my patterns done. But what I actually found is if I'm doing a pattern like this, it's normally Travis picking. If I take this finger out and I put my ring finger in its place, and it takes a second, but that's the same pattern. I just took my ring finger out and reshuffled the fingers around, especially because I play with 5 fingers. If one or two of my fingers is down, you know, I can shuffle stuff around. It actually wasn't nearly as hard as I thought it was going to be. That's the basic idea, is if you have different techniques that you've learned, if you have broadened your vocabulary, you can get through a lot more stuff even when you have problems coming up. I remember one time I saw an Eric Johnson tutorial on harmonics. I mean, the guy had showed so many ways of doing harmonics I hadn't even known of. He had like 10 or 12 ways to play regular harmonics, and it's like that just blew my mind at the time. But I realized, like, really advanced guitarists, they don't think of any technique in a one-dimensional way. You know, they're like, okay, you can't play things with your right hand, tap it all with your left hand. You can't do scales like this, just go. You know, just practice tapping everything out, because then you can focus on the left hand. One of the things Max and I were doing in our one lesson, we're working on bar chords. When we couldn't use the right hand at first, or we could just strum one chord, we put a metronome on, but we actually were focusing more on the transitions with the bar chords. So you can find that even with things that are really challenging like that you're working towards, and you practice them until you're blue in the face, when you come up with a new approach to practice them, it actually stimulates your brain and keeps you going, even when you're really starting to get bored with something. So never ever look at the performance injuries you have as a reason to be limited. Look at them as a reason to go deeper, to come up with new ideas, and to go further into what you're doing. And now for the question nobody asked. How do I know people are going to like the music I'm going to play? I feel like people actually do ask this question a lot, but they kind of ask it inside as like an emotional question rather than outside as a science question. And I think it's sad that people don't ask this often enough, because, you know, when you're trying to learn music, you know, usually the thing that's driving you to learn music and the way that it's gonna actually affect people usually aren't connected in your brain or even in the world sometimes. So it's like, and when you don't consider that stuff, a lot of times you spend a ton of time practicing stuff that's really no good, and that's just like, man, nobody's got time for that. Really, really good example is, you know, if you spend a ton of time learning to play songs for like a cover band, but then you go out and you find like, you know, nobody's hiring cover bands, you know. And I mean, I'm not saying that as just like a random example. I see that all the time. Tons of people want to be in bands and play for people, but you find like these days especially, you know, there's not as many gigs around as there used to be. People who are playing them are kind of playing them for peanuts. I don't know, at least in the area I'm in. You know, all the old time professionals are telling me the gigs are all shrinking. But what I will say is that, you know, if you start out with a big project and you don't think to yourself, man, what is it that people are actually going to leave their house to come see? Then you could spend a ton of time practicing stuff that no one's really going to use, or really no one's going to want to listen to. All too often, I teach so many people who want to learn new stuff, and it's like learning stuff is fun and stimulating and stuff, but when you have no idea how you intend it to affect people eventually, you almost inevitably hit the stage where you're just like, man, what did I do all that for? And it's like really soul-sucking to do that. One thing I really encourage people to just give some thought to whenever you start learning a new technique is like, okay, how are people going to hear this? And even if it's a simple question like, you know, am I going to make a YouTube channel out of it? Am I going to go play it live at like some joint around here? Think from the perspective of the listener. Think about like what other people are putting out there and what you like to go see. And you think to yourself, okay, if I'm going to put this out there, are people really going to be affected by it the way I want them to? You don't have to freak out. You don't want this question to make you stressed or to make you not do anything or not take any adventures. What you want to do is focus a little bit on the things that really matter, you know, rather than learning to play like 3 hours of songs that no one's going to listen to. Why don't you spend all that time on making one song really, really awesome that, you know, that's really going to affect how people see stuff. It's like, that might be more worth your time. The general comment I'll make is that I've seen a lot more people succeed with less effort through creative effort than through just technical effort. If you take an example of like shred guitarists, there's so many talented shred guitarists out there, and that's such a difficult set of techniques to learn. But it's like when you watch them on YouTube, a lot of times people just looking there and they're like, man, it's another shred guitarist. It's like, it ends up being white noise after a while, whereas you can just do little things to like open up people's imaginations about what's possible. And yeah, it's effort to do creative stuff, but it's just as much effort to learn a ton of difficult, like learn a gajillion notes and then have nobody listen to them is just defeating. Really thinking from the listener's perspective and asking, what can I give? Rather than how can I get people to watch me? It's like, that's how you really get that exchange with the audience. That's how you really get people to care about what you're doing and enjoy what you're doing. And you get that kind of vibe you get from sharing your music with people. That's all for this episode of Questions Nobody Asked. If you're digging it, hit the subscribe button. If you're feeling like you want to see more of this happen, jump on the Patreon campaign. That's kind of how I support all this work. So anyone who feels like they want to see more of this, see it get more advanced, jump on there. It's, you know, it's a definite correlation between how good of material I can do and, you know, how much people are supporting. So give that some thought. Don't be strangers. Ask questions in the comments for what you want to see answered next week. Deuces, y'all.